Okay. Thank you all for joining me today. And I'm going to go through a little housekeeping before I welcome Cheryl to this talk. I'm so looking forward to it. This is a long time coming for us. We met a long time ago. I mentioned in my email, Tim Tate introduced us when we were in Miami. We had dinner together, a great time, and we thought of her for this year's NGG. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that. Let me kick in with this computer here, kick to the next screen. So exciting news for 2023. Those of you who don't know, the GAS conference is coming here in 2023. We had some meetings with the members and they pulled it together rather quickly. It's an exciting town for the glass arts. We call it the Mecca of the North. There's all kinds of avenues here for exploration into the exciting medium from our world, like contemporary glass art. There's education down at CCS and colleges and institutions around. And then there's a huge pipe community. Many of you saw the Robert Mickelson talk through the AACG, which was quite incredible. It was a very layman's exploration into the pipe art world, which I really appreciated, and wrote him a fine note about it. And they actually made sales from it, which is great. But that community is coming here for 2023, and it's going to be, let me click the next slide before I play this, is June 7th through 10th, 2023. We're moving our international to be around that same time. We're trying to figure out the details because we want to have an event for our VIPs of our auction and whatnot before we start kicking into what's going on. But what better place to be? So plan on being here in 2023. I'm going to show you this. Hopefully my audio is working. Let me try and make sure it stays down. This is a little for that.
Motown, the Motor City. Detroit's had its time on top, and now, with hard work and people who believed and never gave up, our time has come again. Because right now, in Detroit, it's revival time. Innovation time. Dinner time. Game time. Showtime. Move-in time. And now's the time to experience all the things you've heard about Detroit for yourself. It's time to see it, taste it, hear it, feel it, witness it, and believe it. This is Detroit, and we're here to tell you it's go time.
Beautiful marketing. Thank you for making it. I recognize some places and places I don't recognize, so it's incredible to see such effort put into something so fun. Let me kick to the next slide if this thing will work. All right, so more housekeeping. The Glass International is still online on habatat.com. We are going to be using the same kind of format for future shows. So check out that if you have yet to. You're also invited to come see the International here at the gallery. It's set up, it's immaculate. I walk through the gallery every day and I still get my mind blown how beautiful it looks. And we moved the 12 Jars Path of Life show into the gallery. Sad to say it's now the 11 Jars because we sold one of them and went out. So 11 Jars Path of Life is still on display. It's an incredible experience. Come and see it. So onward and upward. NGG, this is our second year, and it's a artwork focused on artists that make work that is not in Grandma's art collection yet. And as I proceed through the years of doing this, I'm wrong. A lot of this artwork is in Grandma's collection, a lot of people's collections, but they create in such a different way than a lot of the contemporaries of the past that I want to keep an eye on them. And we had Morgan Peterson, who was the very first speaker or presenter in Not Grandma's Glass, give a talk during our International, and that talk is on our YouTube page if you want to see it, along with Lucy Lyon and Patricia Duggan from the Imagine Museum. It's coming together and it's a lot of fun, and I've already selected the artists for 2023, so I'm looking forward to putting that plan together and signing the ball rolling, which I'm ahead of the game because usually I do that in August. So welcome Cheryl. Welcome and thank you for being here. Say hi to everybody. I appreciate you joining me today and being part of our NGG world and joining our Habatat family. Let me see what it says next. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll talk a little bit about more NGG, but go ahead and say hi to everybody.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Good morning on the West Coast. Good afternoon on the East Coast. And this is the most exciting thing ever. And even though she's down low, shout out to my cousin who's out there. I see you, Sharon. Thank you for joining the Habatat family. Thank you, Aaron, for this honor.
Great to have you. So I'll have you take over the screen right now and it's going to be a lot of fun. Like I said, I met Cheryl in Miami and we had a great time together and learned a little bit about her, but this is going to be my class. I'm joining you as we explore her world. So feel free to maximize and you are good to go.
Great. Well, thank you again. For those of you I haven't met before, I'm Cheryl Derricotte. I am a visual artist and a licensed city planner, and I'm excited to share sort of some background about my work, as well as some really exciting new work that I created for this Habatat opportunity. So here we go. I always start by saying that I stand for art and liberation. I think we live in a time when we all need to figure out what we stand for. And I really believe that art can give us a vehicle to have the kind of difficult conversations that we need to have in our society. And I truly believe that the gallery and the museum are both the brave places to hold those conversations. We're going to talk about how it started, how it's going, and a mountain road in the middle. So how it started, I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and I first was introduced to glass at the Washington Glass School with Tim Tate, Mike Janis, and Erwin Timmers. And the piece you're looking at on the left was my very first glass sculpture. That was about 20 years ago, and it's called Shed Some Light. And the story of that piece is, unbeknownst to me, there was actually a Washington Post reporter embedded in the class that was covering the new glass school. And she started following me and Erwin around when I said, oh, I want to make a sculpture about world poverty. And then in those days, we had not yet met Aaron. This was long before Aaron, and we used to hang our own shows. So we hung a show. And it turned out that the Washington Post art critic came and he actually wrote about this piece as an example of narrative glass. And at that point, Tim pulled me aside and said, you know, I think you might have a future in this if you stick with it. And so that began my 20-year journey with the medium we all love. How's it going? Well, it's going pretty good. And the metal and glass houses have gotten a little bigger. On the right is my design for a new monument to Harriet Tubman. And on the left is the architect's rendering of where the sculpture will be placed. It's a new transit-oriented development called Gateway at Millbrae. Millbrae, the city of Millbrae, is home to the Millbrae BART station and the Caltrain intersection right by San Francisco Airport. And so my sculpture is going to go on a newly renamed street called Harriet Tubman Way. What's exciting for folks on this call is that this will actually be the first monument to Harriet Tubman that features glass. So it'll be a 12-foot metal sculpture that's powder-coated aluminum, and then the centerpiece will be glass tile, which I will make here in my studio, which is where I'm coming from today. And I will just hold up so you can see one of the color samples that I've done for Harriet. And you can see her face looking pretty good. So we don't have a firm date yet, as you can imagine, when a developer is making 400 units of housing, 2 office buildings, 2 hotels. There's not a hard stop on the construction, but we're hoping that everything will get installed in September, and I'll be sure to share the information with Aaron so he can share it with all of you. The mountain road in between. So a part of that pulling me aside by Tim 20 years ago was him saying, I think you need to go to this place called Penland. And it's in North Carolina, and it's where I learned how to blow glass. And more importantly, you need to go this summer because there's this guy named Thurman Statham teaching, and he's also from DC, but more importantly, he's the most famous Black glass artist. And I think you need to see somebody that looks like you right away so you know it's possible. So even 20 years ago, representation mattered, and I'm grateful to have teachers that understand that. These are some examples of work I've made at Penland over the years. When I went to Penland initially for Thurman's class, it was actually a class in large scale sculpture. And so it was also my intro to glass blowing class. And so the work on the left was a suite of blown glass tornadoes called Gentrification by Nature. The great Dave Nato was the TA for that class and was the gaffer on this work. And it really kind of established me early on as a museum artist because the work went to a show called Terrestrial Forces at the Florida State Museum. The work on the right that you're looking at shows more techniques that I settled into over the years because along the way I figured out that I wanted my own studio and that may not involve a furnace running 24/7. And so at the top, you see an altered book that I did with glass, as well as a smaller meditation lantern showing enamel and powder printing techniques. And both of these ways of working, those were from a workshop with Susan Taylor Glasgow that I know many of you know. And it's a way I've continued to work in my art practice. I actually did go back to Penland the next year for a 2-month concentration in Venetian glass blowing. Again, didn't become a glass blower, but it was really important to me to be rooted in my craft and be present in the hot shop if I wanted to collaborate with other artists along the way, have an understanding of what the material could do, you know, what the tools were, and albeit rusty, you know, can get on the floor and at least be an assistant and bring the color and take a heat. We're going to shift a little bit. More recently, I had a solo show. It was my first solo show at the Museum of the African Diaspora. And for that show, I created 12 glass artworks, 12 works on paper, and also what I call a video diary. So you're seeing a view of the gallery with the video, and this gentleman was actually my muse. I do a lot of work exclusively with images from the public domain, historical images, or my own photographs, so that obviously I don't want to step on any other artist's copyright issues. And so that's my choice about how to manage that issue. When I found this historic photograph of this enslaved gentleman and these visible scars, I felt like he very much would be a muse for this show I created at MOAD in 2016, because they're all about diaspora. Here's some examples of the glass pieces that were in that show. You see how the gentleman translated in glass. This is enamel work on sheet glass. So, you know, pretty much medium fire temperatures with enamels. I liked having the juxtaposition of two people with head wraps as a nod to sort of contemporary fashion that's continued through the ages. And then, of course, the woman at the bottom right with her hands up is a reminder that this notion of hands up, don't shoot is not a new one. We heard a lot about it, but here was a historic image from the archives in the British Library from the 1800s showing that, you know, there's always been this chase and this fear and Black people with their hands up. This is a look at how I remix work. And so I took some photographs of the Chevron refinery, which is in Richmond. And believe it or not, you can just walk down the street in Richmond and see the big oil refinery right there. So I was across the street from it when I took these photographs. And so the first piece on the right that I'll call your attention to was the original work done in glass, in enamel. And then on the left, about 4 years later, the photograph was remixed for a show of billboards in 3 cities sponsored by Save Art Space. And so my billboard again highlighted Richmond and paired it with text from a Clean Air Task Force report about how many Black people actually live in proximity to an oil refinery in the United States. And so the billboard was up the month of February in 2021. And then, because it's always exciting to say the words, and so is one of the great Judy Chicago's environmental pieces on a billboard at the same time in Los Angeles.
Cheryl, could you read what it says on the billboard? It's kind of hard to see from.
I sure can. Thank you. So the title of the work, Living on the Fence Line, 6.7 million Black people live in one of the 95 US counties with an oil refinery. And that's from a joint report, which I note there. The source is the Clean Air Task Force, CATF, plus the NAACP. And that was a 2017 report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and my billboard was pretty visible. It was on Hollywood Boulevard and Wilshire. So even though it was the pandemic, you know, a lot of people were able to see the work and engage with it, and hopefully looked up the task force report to learn more about this issue. I still make books. You know, you saw that authored book I did with Susan's workshop at Penland around, I think that was 2015 or 2016. And I still enjoy making books. We're kind of spoiled in the Bay Area because we have the San Francisco Center for the Book, which has all the old machines you could dream of. And I take my same sort of themes, historical narratives placed into contemporary conversations into my book practice. And so this is an example of an accordion book that I made for a show a few years ago based on a wanted poster for a 17-year-old runaway slave named Emily. And that's why I titled the piece Emily, because it really just sort of tells her story. The river was actually the river on the Ohio-Kentucky border. So that's where she was running. These are some recent books that were just published in 2022. After a very long pandemic delay, I was able to complete a residency at Antenna's Paper Machine in New Orleans in November of 2021. And I dived into the history of a woman named Mary Ellen Pleasant. And for those of you not from the Bay Area who may not know her, Mary Ellen Pleasant was the richest Black woman in San Francisco during the gold rush. The origins of her story, like many formerly enslaved people, are kind of murky, but we do know that she ended up in Nantucket about the age of 10 as an indentured servant, because they didn't call it slavery, in Nantucket, to a Quaker family that ran one of the stores. And because Nantucket was such a booming whaling town at the time, from the age of 10 into adulthood, she learned amazing skills about how to run businesses, what it takes when suddenly you go from bust to boom. And she brought all those skills with her to the West Coast. And so these two books sort of tell her story, her journey from Nantucket on one of the mail boats, because we used to have people travel on the same steamships as the mail back in the 1850s. And to tie it into New Orleans, the boat actually made port in New Orleans before going around the tip of South America on out to San Francisco and finally docking in Oregon. That was the final stop of the mail. And so, you know, I always try to make work that's accessible for lots of different audiences. So the book on the left is actually a limited edition. That's the mock-up, but the final book is actually limited edition, 12 copies, linen hardbound, more of a collector's item. The book on the right is available through the nonprofit's website, and that's like $10, and they sell it at Printed Matter and all the places where, you know, next-gen collectors might be found. So my studio, which looks beautiful right there under the rainbow, is in a neighborhood called the Bayview. in San Francisco. And once upon a time, Bayview was one of the traditional Black neighborhoods. There's a lot of historic uses as well in Bayview because it ties into the neighboring shipyard Hunters Point. And so a lot of metalsmiths, maybe 20 years ago, were worried they were going to get put out of the shipyards. And so they relocated over to these studios. And it's one of the last places, quite frankly, in San Francisco where people who do industrial work can have studios. So I moved in just about a year ago because my previous studio was a whopping 135 square feet. And when you get a 12-foot sculpture, you begin to think about how much space you have to move around. So here's some views of my studio so you can see what's going on around me. That's my kiln, which is called Emerald City. I just wanted to give it a nice name and pick a good color. And so you see a lot of bullseye there on the shelf because at this point I do a lot of powder printing work. And I should also say, it's not like I made up any of these techniques. You know, I'm near a bullseye center in Emeryville, so I've certainly taken classes over the years with people who have taught there, like, you know, Jeremy Sidmore, his wife, Carrie Iverson, who's a printmaker. I actually learned powder printing from Stacy Lynn Smith, who's now in LA, but when she was in the Bay Area. And I just felt like the powder printing ultimately was a place that I was getting a lot of expression and texture on the glass that I really enjoyed. So let's talk about the influences on my glass career. So on the left, that beautiful human is my mother. And my mother never wanted an artist. And it was very funny over the years because, you know, like I came from single mom, working class roots. You know, when I asked her one time, I said, "Mommy, are we middle class?" She said, "No, we're middle lower class. We don't live in the projects, but we still in red brick apartment buildings." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And so, you know, she wanted lawyer, doctor, and if I had to, undertaker, but artist was not on her radar at all, even though I was expressing all the tendencies all throughout my childhood and teen years. And then as I got older, it was actually my grandmother who let me know that, in fact, my mother used to take me to like civil rights marches, marches for welfare moms. I would later meet, and we're so happy to see one of my former board members when I worked at a nonprofit in Maryland, outside of DC, my home. Another board member who many people know, Alex Simpson, actually was a dear friend of my father when he was alive, and they were in high school. And he told me how my father had been a musician, and I started digging and found out my mom and dad had met in band in junior high school, okay, years before they got married and had me. And yet this woman could not understand how she had an artist and activist. It was the most amazing thing on the planet, you know? And on the right, looking fantastic, because this was actually their wedding picture. They got married later in life, in their 30s, is my great aunt Teeny and my great uncle Irvin, who I mentioned in my write-up. And they were actually the glass collectors in my family. So glass was always very present through them, and they enjoyed collecting the full spectrum. You know, they loved getting glass from like West Virginia, and they'd find it in antique shops from the old factories because they grew up in a major metropolis called Wytheville in Wythe County in Virginia, and had many friends in West Virginia. And then for holidays and anniversaries and birthdays, they would actually buy a piece of Waterford crystal. So they had this amazing Waterford crystal collection. And once I got to glass, a funny thing happened because my mother was like, "No, I don't know how this happened." Aunt Teeny and Uncle Irvin said, "Glass, yes." and she stood down, because when elders speak,
Right.
you stand down. And so I had carte blanche to just dive into glass, thanks to Aunt Teeny and Uncle Irvin. And I must say, along the way, you know, my mother became a huge supporter of my glass career, and, you know, would love everything about what's happening right now if she was still here, as would great Aunt Teeny and Uncle Irvin. And so I'm going to take you to a project that shows you how I weave personal history with American history. And it's going to take us into the work that I made for Habatat and how we get there. So my mother's maiden name was Jefferson, and that's true. She had always wanted to prove that we were related to Thomas Jefferson, but unfortunately did not live long enough to be able to do that research. But she used to get a kick out of telling people when we were in Virginia, and she'd raise her eyebrow, you know, our name is Jefferson, hint, hint. And I would just be like, Mommy, stop doing that, you know. I have since learned it may be true, but I don't really dive into the history myself. What happened when many of us were, you know, locked up during the pandemic and I couldn't get into the glass studio, I was invited to do a show at the French Consulate in San Francisco. And they were planning to bring over French artists for a new residency. And when that couldn't happen, they offered local artists the opportunity to be in residence. So the first thing I thought was, okay, does this curator know the kind of work I do? And she said, yes. And I said, okay, I'm getting a hit on Thomas Jefferson. She said, go for it. So given that he was, you know, our most famous and notorious French ambassador in those days, he was actually, his title was the Prime Minister to the Court of Versailles. We hadn't got to ambassador yet. I decided I wanted to dive into Thomas Jefferson. So I made this triptych of work, and this is the first panel, which features Tom. He's about in his 40s, and that's an antique wallpaper that I replaced with the image of wheat. This is also true. You know, the town I mentioned to you, Wytheville in Wythe County, is less than 3 hours from Monticello. So it is wholly conceivable that my mother was onto something. I have an image of Monticello and the wheat because part of Thomas Jefferson's, let's just call it his complexity. Let's stay nice this Saturday afternoon. Part of his complexity was that he wanted to run a kinder, gentler plantation. And so he moved away from growing tobacco and cotton, which of course were brutal crops, and did a lot more with wheat. And he loved wheat and his bread because he had been in France for so long during his time as ambassador. And so this was a quote that Thomas Jefferson said more than once verbally and in writing, but as it is, we have the wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. And the quote continues to say, justice is in one scale and self-preservation is in the other. And that lets everyone know that he was very clear that the institution of slavery was wrong, but the self-preservation side of things was also important to he and many other people in the South. And so there's the full triptych. Each panel is 11 by 14. And I liked using the wolf and centering on that quote because also the wolf is such a storied character in French literature as well. I know some of you, have heard that old quote. Actually, Genet, said the quote a lot, between le loup, the wolf, and le chien, the dog. What is that space of tension in between and fear? So I like being able to bring that into the work as well. This work was an addition of 6. I made 6 because Thomas Jefferson had 6 children with Sally Hemings. And so the next sort of phase of this work, I'm actually picking up at Corning. Hint, hint, I know some of you got it in the promotions that when Aaron challenged me to make work for my dream museum, because I'm going in residence to Corning, this winter, it was an opportunity to think, ooh, what could I contribute to Corning possibly? So nations can't outrun their genes. And so when we understand this history of a founding father and the Black side of his family, it's important that we confront all of it. And one of the lesser known people in Thomas Jefferson's sphere in the Hemings family was actually Sally Hemings' older brother, James. And James Hemings had accompanied Jefferson initially to France and trained as a chef de cuisine. And he's very much a part of the reason we eat a lot of things that we eat in the South, most notably macaroni and cheese, because there are all these stories of Jefferson's guests and how much they loved the quote unquote macaroni pie. And James had trained as a French chef. It was actually a bechamel sauce that he was making and translating that into foods that were more readily available in America when they came back. And so at Corning, I'm going to start looking at what my table settings, what my glassware, what might all of that have looked like in the late 1700s when James was in Paris with Thomas Jefferson to try to create a portrait of James, because like so many formerly enslaved people, we don't have any pictures of him. And so now we're turning to the work that I made for Habatat, and my show is called Glass Boys: Portraits from American Factories. And, you know, social media is a wonderful thing, and I happened to see, not this particular image, but another image of a group of young Black boys that said glass factory workers. And I was like, whoa, stop the press, because there was so much conversation over the past couple of years about, you know, Black glass artists and indigenous glass artists and where are we, and on and on and on. And I was like, well, here's some right here that I knew nothing about. And when I wrote to the person that actually had posted it on social media, I didn't hear back from them because that really wasn't their thing. It was like a website that sort of showed slices of Black history, and they didn't really care about the glass aspects and on, but I was off to the races. And so I started digging into these images and found out that many of them came from the portfolio of Louis Hine, who in and of his own right was an interesting person. I'm going to just shift. Louis Hine had documented child labor. He was a contemporary, clearly, of the WPA folks. We know very well Dorothea Lange, Gordon Parks, but as life would have it, Roy Stryker, who headed the Farm Security Administration, did not like Louis Hine. So he never gave him a job. And so even though Louis Hine completed this very powerful work about the conditions of child labor at the behest of, I think it was the SAGE Foundation, had sponsored it, his career kind of ended and he fell into obscurity. In terms of what I shared with you earlier about taking historical images and putting them into our contemporary dialogue, what I found fascinating, aside from the fact that some of these boys look 10, is that they were also interracial. The factory was not segregated. And so you see these pictures like this one, when they're doing the portraits of the boys side by side, there are pictures of them on the factory floor, side by side at the glory holes. There was no distinction. And, you know, they had swagger. I mean, look at them, folded arms. I mean, they are glass blowers, even though they're little tiny glass blowers, you know, the Black ones and the white ones. They're like, we are here. We're not afraid to take our picture in front of the factory. This is who we are. So I was very enamored of them when I found them. And so I felt like this was actually the original image I saw of these all Black glass boys, you know, and that tiny one who might be 10 on a good day. And so in making the work for this show, I just thought, well, there's something I can contribute to Corning if I were invited to contribute to Corning after this Habatat opportunity. Here's a slice of glass history elevated again in our lifetime through the practice of glass art. Another image, mixed race group of boys together in front of the factory. And all of this work is powder printed. So sheet glass and then multicolor powder print. If you could see this studio, it looks like one big screen factory right now. There's so many screens everywhere. And so in closing, you know, I feel like glass art really is our mirror to the past and to the present. And I'm still holding space for our collective liberation. And I hope that my art contributes to that conversation and helps get us there. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And thank you so much for this honor, Aaron. And thanks everyone for coming. And of course, if there's questions or comments, happy to do it.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was great. I have a question, obviously, on this presentation. It was great to hear your perspective and where you came from and where you're going next. It's great. Technical question. These panels, are they designed to mount to a wall, or how are they actually, how do they actually go in my house if I put one right there?
Yes. So I actually made the panels to perfectly fit an 18-inch bullseye shelf for display. So they're easy to mount and you can hang them on the wall that way.
Okay, so they sit on a shelf.
Yes.
Okay, so there's no mounting to the back of them.
No,
Okay.
in the Bay Area, we keep our museum putty close. You know, we put a little, we have a little shake, rattle, and roll. So we make sure that we do put a little bit on the back of pieces.
Oh, gotcha. Great, great. Anybody have other questions? Feel free to raise your hand now. I'll check the chat. People have that commenting on your works and the presentation, which is great. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Rabina. Go ahead.
Rabina again.
Rabina, good to meet you.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how it works for you in your brain to be going back and forth between glass and paper and the different things you incorporate into your artistic practice?
Yes, thanks for that question. You know, I think for me, sort of everything starts with glass, you know, and I would say that I think about how the images, particularly the portraits in particular, they just, to me, really lend themselves to glass practice more so than the work on paper. I think there's a certain translucency, and because they're historical images, it definitely gives you sort of that ephemeral, almost ghostly feeling of these historical images. So I think glass, in my brain at least, is particularly well suited to that. With the work on paper, I think that it's more so thinking about how can that complement the glass, quite honestly. Are there stories that need more text than you might be able to put into a glass image? And so even though for me, text and image are always together, and with my glass work, usually naming the pieces is as much a part of putting the text together with the image, there's still a lot of history that you may not be able to read in a glass piece. And so I think that's the place where work on paper, whether that's in print or whether that's in book form, is helpful. The recent books, you know, for example, the book I mentioned with Mary Ellen Pleasant's story, the hardbound book, you know, within that book, there are actually some images that are bound in on translucent paper. So it was a way to sort of bring glass into the book, so to speak. And I really appreciated that about the nonprofit that, you know, I was at. Vellum was one of the things they could do. So I was like, that's great, because that's glass in the book. And I love that. So I'm always thinking about how the two may speak to each other.
Thank you, Cheryl, for answering that question. Any others?
I got one. Here.
Go ahead,
Hey,
Tim.
Cheryl. You know, I love the paper piece of yours. I went to the Young Museum, and I have figured out a really good way of making that larger and in glass. Whenever you're ready, girl, because it'd be spectacular. So I'm just going to throw that out to you. Just keep that in your
Well,
head.
thank you so much. So the piece that Tim is referring to, I actually, so again, during the pandemic, a number of institutions also did local shows as they changed their calendar around to deal with, you know, shipping and people not being able to travel. So the DeYoung Museum, which is one of our really great museums, and I know people on this call, some of you know the Sachs collection at the DeYoung Museum because it's fabulous. But anyway, they did a show of local artists. And so some work I had been doing over the last several years, which utilized large calendars, which I actually got from the At a Glance calendar company. Somebody has put up a picture of it. Hello, thanks for coming out as my collector, Robana. Love that. Robana is a work on paper collector, and after hanging out with Erin, may become a glass collector. But that's the work. And so it's actually a large calendar, and I hand stamp bullets symbolizing how many Black men were killed each day on the calendar. And so when you see it all rendered together, it's kind of binary code like. It's also very powerful because you're like, whoa, what happened that day in history that 4 Black men got shot by the police? So it's definitely a body of work that I have continued to think about and come back to. I had to sort of put myself in a window. So I put myself in a 5-year window of 2016 to 2020. And aside from making work larger in glass, I actually have been thinking about maybe a quilt structure, because even though these calendars focused on Black men who were shot by the police, because that was the conversation we were having as a society, it would be really great, in my opinion, to show how many people total get shot by the police in America every year. And that's a bigger number, that's messier in the 1-year calendar format.
Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing that. Any more questions? I'm going to quickly share my screen again, just to show everybody where the presentation is. So visit notgrandmasglass.com. You'll see Cheryl's link here. You can, this talk hopefully will be hosted right here to watch in the future. Her exhibition, should you click that link, will take you to her page to see the works that she's discussing that are available for purchase. And we've actually posted them on Artsy. There's 5 of them, but for some reason the 5th one's not showing up. We're going to figure that out. But the pricing's there. All work is subject to shipping, but they are all available. I'll click on this one just for the context of it. And there's dimensions there of 12 by 18 by 1. And she mentioned they sit on a shelf. So that's a very good, important part of this whole presentation. So honored to have you, Cheryl, today. This was absolutely fantastic. It's right on the button of what this show's about, is exposing what you're doing and why. And the key there is why, because it's incredible. It has such meaning and it's eye-opening. And I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else has. So thank you again for joining us. And thank you everybody for being here today. We're going to try to, I'm going to put together another presentation for next week talking about the gas conference. So mark your calendars for then, but just a quick note about that. But thank you again, Cheryl, for being here, and I was honored to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you everyone for coming.
So nice to see you, Cheryl. Thank you so much for this. It's
Thank
always
you.
Thank you.
presentation.
Bravo, amazing work.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin. Thanks, everyone.
Most welcome. Like I said, this will be posted up soon for replay, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. Talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Erin.
Bye, Cheryl. Bye, honey.
Bye-bye. Thanks for coming, everyone.